Hello, I am the Sad Comedian, and this is my channel, The Howling Laughter. Today, we are going to speak about censorship. Now, that's something long time back. That wouldn't happen today anymore. You know, the church censored Galileo. They excommunicated him. They put him under house arrest for saying that the earth moves around the sun. Did you know Galileo could not explain this properly? Galileo said that it is the tides which are evidence for the motion of the earth. Ebb and flood show us that the earth is moving. That's what he said. Johannes Kepler pointed out to him that there's a correlation between the motion of the moon and the tides. But Galileo, he called that witchcraft. So he was excommunicated and put under house arrest. He wasn't even allowed to go to church anymore. Did he cry? Maybe. Galileo kept petitioning the Pope to please allow him to go to church. Please. Over and over and over again, he begged the Pope. And 5 years after his conviction, the Pope actually gave in. And he allowed Galileo to go to church on holy days. But only if he promised not to speak to anybody. He wasn't allowed to speak to anybody. Why would he want to go to church? Why would anybody want to go to church? Why doesn't he want to sit at home and watch TV or YouTube, looking at weird guys talking rubbish? Huh? Why not? In those days, there was no TV. There was not even an opera or a concert hall. The king might have had an orchestra, but that was at the court. Anybody who would have wanted to listen to music had to go to church. There was no radio. Most people couldn't read. They wanted to hear an interesting story. They had to go to church. They went twice a day, morning and evening. And during the day, they were out in the field plugging out weeds or other real interesting stuff. Church was the highlight of the day to those people. Now, the priest would have told them a sermon in their own language. But the Mass, the formal part, the Bible readings, they were done in Latin. And Galileo probably spoke Latin, but most Italians, most people further up north in Central Europe, they did not. Why would they like to hear the Mass read in Latin? Did you know that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones became famous first in Germany? The Beatles in Hamburg, the Rolling Stones in Berlin. And they were most popular with the working class people, with those people who didn't speak English. Those people who could speak English, they would say about them, where are the violins? Where is the sheet music? This can't be any good. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were popular with those people who did not speak English. They would go down the street and sing a Beatles song as well as they could, without actually understanding the words. In the same way, in the old days, people liked the Mass in Latin. And just the fact that they couldn't understand it, that added mystery to it. Made it more interesting. Yeah. As a matter of fact, there was no German language in Central Europe. People in today's northern Germany would speak a language different from those in Bavaria, as different as Dutch and German today, or Spanish and Portuguese. They couldn't understand each other. The common language in those days was Latin, which not everybody understood. But same thing today in India. In India, the common language is English. Don't they have an Indian language? Yes, they have Hindu. But there are many places where Hindu is not spoken, and they actually object to being forced to speak Hindu. So in India, everybody speaks English. In Europe, everybody spoke Latin. Not really everybody. Just like today, there would be some peasants in India who would grow rice all their life, never leave the little village. They only speak their local language. Same thing in Europe. There were people who didn't speak Latin, who would be on a little farm and not leave that farm all their lives. They did not speak Latin. Luther, through his Bible translation, he created the German language. That was in the same century as Galileo was born. Okay? That's when Luther created the German language by his Bible translation, by taking bits and pieces from all over Germany and using that in the translation of the ancient Hebrew and Greek texts. That's how the German language was created. So the church read the Mass in Latin. That was the language of the time. Was the church really backwards? Galileo was not the first one to actually propose that the earth is moving around the sun. Copernicus, who lived a century before Galileo, a Catholic priest he was, he proposed it before him. And the church did the calendar reform during Galileo's time. It took them 200 years to do it. They brought in the Gregorian calendar, named after Pope Gregory. The calendar before was the Julian calendar. Now here are women in science. Who was Julie? Julie was Julius Caesar. Okay? 46 BC, he introduced his calendar. And it was a very good calendar. It was valid for 1,600 years. In the 15th century, there are the first records of a need of a correction. And the church consulted Copernicus, the guy who had proposed that the earth is moving around the sun. And he said, well, we need to do more measurements. And he did more measurements, but he didn't finish them before he died. The improvement was 10 days in 1,600 years, an improvement of 0.0017%. Now that's excellent scientific work, even by today's standards. But Galileo, he had the misfortune to come up with this discussion in the middle of the 30-Year War. There were places in Europe that lost more than 2/3 of the population in the 30-Year War. This war was more disastrous, percentage-wise, than the world wars of the last century. So he was placed under house arrest. He also offended the Pope with a book that he had written. So he was placed under house arrest. How bad was house arrest? He wrote a book there called Two New Sciences, Kinematics and Materials. And this book, that really had influence on the work of scientists for generations to come. Stephen Hawking said about this book that that was a precursor to Isaac Newton's work. Isaac Newton was born half a year after Galileo had died. Now that's all a long time ago. Today, we won't have censorship. Today, we get peer review. What does that do? We try to protect democracy. There were people in the United States trying to say we need to change the democratic process so that Donald Trump can't become president. That's democracy, yeah. I mean, what's wrong with these populists anyway? These populists, they go out and talk to people and try to get them to vote for them. That's very undemocratic. You know, democracy, you have to go to university and you got to say something that nobody understands. Then everybody's going to be impressed with you. You know, they think you're so smart. You got to use meta-language. What's that? That's a meta-long language? I don't know. Adolf Hitler was voted in. Today, the press tries to tell us what to think. And the press did for the last 100, 200 years. Now there are two types of press. There's government-controlled press and there's business-controlled press. But is there free press? As a matter of fact, this was just counting. You know, I wouldn't do such a thing, all right? Okay? So, and then today we complain about fake news. Anybody can say anything on the internet. But before there was the press, and before people would stay home and watch TV all night, people would go out to the pub, and they would solve the problems of the world in the pub. Kick out all the wops, give everybody a job, easy. Yeah, man. And today, we complain about fake news on social media. Do you realize Albert Einstein would never have amounted to anything today? Albert Einstein failed his maths at school. Albert Einstein did so poorly at university that his professors refused to give him a reference. He couldn't get a job. He got a job through an uncle of his at the Berne Patent Office. And you know what these public servants are like. They just sit around, drink coffee all day, read newspapers and books, and oh, there's some work. Oh yeah, tomorrow. We'll do that tomorrow. Yeah. But Albert Einstein, he was a weirdo, you know. He was a retard. He really was. He learned to walk at 3 years of age, to speak about 5 years of age. And maths, well, he didn't cope well with it at high school. But because he was a weirdo, he didn't sort of chatter with the other public servants. He was sitting around, you know, doodling with mathematical formulas on some paper. And, this actually works. He was very impressed with himself. So he took what he had there and sent it to the major periodical on physics in those days. Annalen in der Physik, it was called. And they didn't have anything better to print, so they just printed it. And he got real famous. Today, this periodical doesn't exist anymore. Today, he would have had to send his work to the Physical Review. Now, in the Physical Review, you can't just write a letter and say, look at this here, that's pretty good, eh? No. You need a recommendation from a reputable professor or two to be published in the Physical Review. There's no way Albert Einstein would have amounted to anything today. I don't think Sigmund Freud would get published today. I had an idea about the interpretation of dreams, but somebody beat me to it. There's a French guy. There's a French writer, Claude Simon. He got the 1985 Nobel Prize for Literature. And some French guy recently sent a 50-page excerpt of one of his Nobel Prize-winning books to 19 different publishers in France. 12 of them rejected it. The sentences are too long. The language is too complicated. The characters are not easy enough to understand. So they rejected it, 12 of them. The others didn't even answer. Now that was Nobel Prize winning work. Wouldn't get published today. That's what you call peer review. Right? Now, and you might think, oh, I'm starting my own internet site. If you write something on the internet, it needs to come up on Google. So you got to do search engine optimization with your text. Not more than 20 words in a sentence. There are certain types of words. They have to make up a certain percentage of the text. And then, no passive voice. Should this be called censorship? Or should we call this censorship? They say active voice is so much more direct. I would say it's also aggressive because it makes the personal matter. Passive, should this be called censorship? That is about the circumstance. It's objective. Should we call this censorship, the active version? It makes it a personal matter. Are we right or are we wrong? You want to take us on? Family values. Today, can anything be published against family values? I mean, if you think about it, family values are one step worse than racism. A racist worries about millions of people or tens of millions of people, depending on how big his race is. A family person worries about 4 or 5 people, maybe. He sends his kid to coaching lessons or to private school so that his kid would beat other kids in the competition for the best jobs in our society. Could this money be spent to fight poverty in the third world? But we have this obsession with monogamy today. Nobody can speak against monogamy. Only one man and one woman, once they're married, no fooling around anymore. And the church, I mean, how primitive was that? They would say, you do it with someone else, you're gonna go to hell. Yeah. Now TV is so much more subtle. You know, on TV, you can watch all the stuff. You wouldn't want to watch that, would you now? Sex scenes? No, of course not. You wouldn't. You know, when Foxtel came in, they advertised on SBS here, and, you know, they showed the sex scenes of the movies. All these movies have a very moral ending. In the end, this immoral person who sleeps around ends up with AIDS. Ugh. Or his family breaks up. He ends up down on the street, homeless. He loses his job. Now, Karl Marx said that religion is opium for the people. Now, if we take that to be true, TV is heroin. Isn't drugging somebody into inactivity or silence another form of censorship? So, I hope you enjoyed that. Now this is my hat. Unfortunately, you can't give me any coins through the internet, but at the end of this clip, there'll be my PayPal details. Sad comedian. Double M. Remember, I'm a comedian. I can't spell. And you could give me 1 or 2 or 3, whatever you got. Dollars, euros, pounds. Let's say you just give me 1. And this symbol here, that stands for nothing. You can click that as often as you want.